The sky above the Grand Exchange tore open like infected flesh. It happened during the Zerosian eclipse, that rare celestial alignment when Zeros's ancient shadow stretched across Varric's spires, turning daylight the color of dried blood. Merchants hawking dragon bones and Renar weed fell silent as reality itself shuddered. The rupture manifested not as an explosion, but as a slow surgical split in the fabric of existence, edges crackling with energy that resembled no known rune magic. Through it, something fell. A man, armored in battered leather and chainmail, twin swords crossed on his back, white hair whipping in winds that came from nowhere. His medallion, a snarling wolf's head, vibrated so violently against his chest that its chain cut into his neck, shrieking a warning against monsters unseen. Geralt of Rivia hit the cobblestones hard, rolling with practiced grace that spoke of countless similar falls, countless other worlds. Behind him, the breach sealed with a wet sound like meat closing over a wound. No magical residue, no lingering enchantment. The runecrafters who would later investigate would find nothing, no trace of teleportation magic, no evidence of dimensional spell work, as if the laws of Gielinor had been momentarily rewritten and then forgot themselves. Geralt rose slowly, cat-yellow eyes scanning the crowd of players and NPCs frozen in collective shock. His hand didn't go to his coin purse. It went to steel. The silver sword would come later, after he identified what kind of monster this place harbored. He muttered something in a language that made the air taste of ozone and old blood. Kurwa, not my world again. Then louder, with the weary pragmatism of a man who'd stumbled through too many portals. Where's the nearest tavern? The crowd erupted. Some thought him a new Grandmaster Quest NPC. Others began typing furiously, convinced this was an unannounced game update. A few, those with higher divination levels, those sensitive to the currents beneath reality, felt their skill capes grow cold. They sensed what the others couldn't. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't meant to be here. When the first Varric guard drew his sword and shouted about unauthorized armed presence in a trading zone, Geralt's expression didn't change, but his stance did. The blade left its sheath with a sound like singing death, and in that moment, every monster slayer in Gielinor felt an inexplicable chill, as if something had entered their world that even dragons might learn to fear. The Varric Palace Guard captain, a man who'd survived the God Wars reenactments and held a combat level of 134, made his first and final mistake when he classified Geralt as a standard hostile. He signaled his squad with the standard formation. 2 rangers to flank, 3 melee to engage, 1 mage for teleblock. It was textbook suppression protocol, the kind that worked on everything from dark wizards to rogue demons. It failed spectacularly. The enchanted crossbow bolts came first, adamant-tipped, blessed by Saradomin priests, capable of piercing dragon hide. They struck an invisible barrier 2 feet from Geralt's body and shattered into golden sparks, the blessing magic unraveling like thread pulled from a tapestry. The Witcher hadn't moved, hadn't chanted, hadn't drawn a single rune from any pouch. His left hand had merely twitched in a gesture that resembled a ward sign, and suddenly the air around him had become solid, shimmering with amber light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Quen," he muttered, almost bored, "holds against worse than that." The melee guards charged. Geralt's response was economical. A single forward thrust of his palm, fingers spread like claws, and the air screamed. The Ard sign hit them like an invisible battering ram, a concussive force that operated on principles no Gielinoran mage could identify. It wasn't airstrike. It wasn't a blast spell. It generated no rune consumption, drew no prayer points, registered on no magical detection ward. 3 armored men flew backward as if kicked by giants, their enchanted plate armor offering no protection against pure kinetic will made manifest. The crowd scattered. Some players tried to right-click Geralt, expecting examine text or dialogue options. They got nothing. Just a man, breathing steadily, eyes tracking the remaining threats with predatory calculation. The battle mage stepped forward, staff crackling with elemental fury. She was no novice. Magic level 94, veteran of the wilderness campaigns, holder of an arcane spirit shield. She began her incantation, weaving law runes and cosmic energy into a teleblock formation, the standard countermeasure against fleeing combatants. The spell matrix formed perfectly, purple-black energy coalescing into binding chains that should have anchored Geralt to this plane, made escape impossible. Geralt's medallion shrieked. His eyes narrowed. He traced a symbol in the air, not with runes, not with prayer, but with the raw geometry of will enforced through mutagen-altered nervous pathways. The Erden sign manifested as a purple glyph beneath the mage's feet, and suddenly her connection to the rune essence faltered. The teleblock spell sputtered, its power draining into the trap circle as if falling into a void. The cosmic runes in her pouch grew cold, dead. For 3 terrible seconds, she couldn't access magic at all, couldn't feel the familiar pulse of the rune altars, the theological connection that underpinned all Gielinoran spellcraft. "Impossible," she whispered, staggering. "Magic doesn't just stop." "Your magic," Geralt corrected, sheathing his blade. "Mine works different." He walked away before reinforcements arrived, melting into the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who'd fled more kingdoms than he'd saved. Behind him, the Varrock guards lay groaning in the dirt, their enchantments broken, their understanding shattered. The battle mage knelt in the center of her failed spell circle, touching the cold runes with trembling fingers, trying to comprehend how power could exist without prayer, without divine permission, without the fundamental laws that governed reality itself. Within the hour, 3 separate emergency councils convened. At the Wizard's Tower, Archmage Cedridor called an immediate assembly. His hands shook as he reviewed the scrying reports, the testimonies, the impossible sensor readings. "His magic generates no rune consumption," he announced to the gathered masters. "No prayer drain, no connection to any altar, any god, any elder artifact. It operates on internal reserves, biological transmutation of will into force. Silence, then chaos." "That's not magic," protested a master of elements. "That's mutation." "It's heresy," countered a Saradominist scholar. "Power without divine sanction is chaos unbound." "Or," said the tower's eldest researcher, voice thin with fear, "it's proof that our entire magical framework is merely one path among many, that the gods are not the source of power, merely one method of accessing it." That suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. To acknowledge it was to undermine 4 ages of theological certainty. If magic could come from within, if mortals could bend reality through discipline rather than devotion, then what separated man from God? What made the divine necessary? At Falador's night command, The Void Knights analyzed combat footage through their mystical viewing crystals. Sir Karasi watched the Ard blast replay for the 7th time, her tactical mind struggling to categorize the threat. No spell animation, no casting delay, instantaneous manifestation of force. She turned to her fellow knights. How do we defend against an attack that has no wind-up, no telegraphing, no rune requirement? We can't, admitted a Void Mage. Our counterspell matrices are built on intercepting runic formations. If there's no formation to interrupt, no prayer to drain, no divine connection to sever. He trailed off, the implications sinking in. Then he's uncounterable by conventional means, Karasi finished grimly. A walking breach in the combat system. But the most disturbing analysis came from the Majorat, those ancient power-hungry demigods who'd survived millennia through cunning and ruthless magical prowess. Azanadra himself, fresh from his Zerosian restoration, examined the residual energy traces left in Varak's cobblestones. His skeletal fingers traced patterns in the air, reading the absence where Geralt's magic had passed. It's not elder energy, he murmured, not Zerosian, not even demonic. He looked up at his fellow Majorat, and for the first time in centuries, they saw something unsettling in his expression. Uncertainty. It's evolved, a mortal who underwent transformation, deliberate, agonizing, and emerged with powers that bypassed divine architecture entirely. He's what we might have become if we'd chosen suffering over ritual, mutation over prayer. Is he a threat? Asked another Majorat. Azanadra's laugh was bitter. To the gods, perhaps. To the established order? Certainly. He's proof that ascension doesn't require their permission. That's the most dangerous idea in Gielinor. By nightfall, every major faction had issued their assessment, and none agreed. The Wizard's Tower classified him as an elder-born anomaly, a desperate attempt to fit him into existing frameworks, suggesting he might be a forgotten experiment of the Elder Gods, a biological prototype abandoned before the creation of humans. The Temple Knights declared him a Zamorakian chaos agent, his rejection of divine authority, his mercenary nature, his brutal efficiency, all supposedly proving allegiance to the god of chaos. The Druids of Taverley saw him as a Gathixian echo, a living embodiment of balance, wielding power without choosing sides, killing monsters but refusing heroism. The Majorat alone came closest to truth, dubbing him the Unmade, a being who'd undergone transformation that rewrote his fundamental nature, making him something between mortal and monster, capable of power without divinity. All of them were wrong. All of them were trying to explain a phenomenon that their reality had no framework for understanding. Geralt of Rivia wasn't an anomaly in Gielinor's systems. He was evidence that their systems were incomplete, that power could exist outside the theological prison they'd built around it. And that realization, spreading through scholarly circles and military command structures alike, was more dangerous than any sword strike or magical sign. Because if one man could wield power without gods, what stopped others from learning the same? If magic was just biology refined through training and discipline, then every peasant, every guard, every overlooked mortal was potentially a witcher in waiting. The divine monopoly on power, the very foundation of Gielinor's social order, suddenly looked fragile. Somewhere in Varak's slums, Geralt found his tavern. He ordered ale, paid in strange coins that no merchant recognized, but accepted anyway, and sat in a dark corner watching the room. His medallion had finally stopped vibrating, for now. But he'd learned to trust that sensation, that warning of monsters nearby. And in a world where gods walked openly, where demons bargained at crossroads, where the dead rose and dragons ruled mountains, his medallion hadn't stopped humming since his arrival. It had merely paused. The real monsters he suspected hadn't shown themselves yet. The War Council of Gielinor convened in a place that technically didn't exist on any map. A sealed archive beneath Falador Castle, warded by magic so old that even the Majorat spoke of it in whispers. The chamber had been used only 3 times in recorded history. Once during Zamorak's betrayal, once when Guthix died, and now. The fact that they'd activated it for a single mortal should have been laughable. Instead, it felt inevitable. Representatives from every major faction sat around an obsidian table that allegedly predated the First Age. The wise old man occupied the neutral seat, his centuries of accumulated knowledge making him the closest thing to an unbiased mediator. To his left sat Commander Karasi and 3 Void Knight captains, their armor dulled to void reflecting the chamber's dim witchlight. To his right, Azanadra represented the Zorosian remnants, his skeletal form wrapped in purple ceremonial robes. Across from them, a Saradominist Templar and a Zamorakian Chaos Druid maintained careful distance, centuries of holy war temporarily suspended. The wise old man spoke first, his voice carrying the weight of genuine fear, an emotion those present had rarely heard from him. We convened this council because classification has failed. In 3 days, Geralt of Rivia has killed 17 monsters, cured 4 incurable curses, refused payment from nobles and peasants alike, and demonstrated combat magic that operates outside every known system. He gestured, and illusory images materialized above a table, scrying recordings, testimony transcripts, alchemical analyses. More troubling, his presence is destabilizing our fundamental understanding of power itself. Commander Karasi leaned forward, her scarred hands flat on the table. My knights have compiled a tactical assessment. It's unprecedented. She activated a viewing crystal, replaying Geralt's encounter with a skeletal wyvern in the Asgarnia wilderness. The footage showed Geralt studying the creature from a ridge, taking notes in a worn journal. No prayer activated, no spell prepared. He descended, and the wyvern attacked, a creature that should have required a full adventuring party, blessed weapons, and protect from magic. Instead, Geralt drew a silver sword, coated in some viscous substance that glowed faintly green, dodged the creature's bone-shattering tail strike with inhuman reflexes, and struck twice, precisely, surgically. The wyvern collapsed, its necromantic bindings unraveling as if the sword had severed connections invisible to normal sight. No protection prayers, Karasi noted. No food consumption for healing. No potion drinking. He relied entirely on movement, timing, and understanding the creature's physiology. Then, this part is crucial, he harvested specific bones and organs, burned the rest with that fire sign of his, and left without looting the general remains. So, challenged the Zamorakian druid, efficient monster slaying. Chaos respects competence. You're missing the point, Karasi snapped. He didn't kill it for experience, for glory, or for treasure. He killed it because it posed a threat to nearby farmers. When they offered payment, he refused. When they asked which temple to donate to in his name, he said, she consulted her notes. Keep your gods. Just bury your dead properly, so this doesn't happen again. Silence fell over the council. That's not neutrality, breathed one of the Void Knights. That's rejection. Active rejection of the entire divine framework. Azanadra's hollow laugh echoed through the chamber. You're only now understanding. The Witcher doesn't see your gods as worthy of worship. He sees them as he sees all powerful beings, potential threats to be assessed, bargained with if necessary, and opposed if they threaten innocence. He's encountered gods before, clearly. They failed to impress him. The wise old man produced a second report, this one from a terrified village healer in Rimington. 4 days ago, a child exhibited symptoms of demonic possession. Classic signs, confirmed by both our Saradominist exorcists and Zamorakian curse readers. The demon had rooted deep, tangled with the girl's life force. Attempting to burn it out would kill her. Leaving it would consume her slowly. Geralt arrived the next morning. He examined the child, asked about her diet and water source, then left for the Rimington mine. He returned with cave nightshade, ground limestone, and several other reagents we're still identifying. Over 6 hours, he brewed a concoction that our alchemists couldn't replicate. It required precise temperature control, specific timing, and what he called intuition born from repetition. The hologram shifted, showing Geralt administering the potion. The child convulsed, black ichor pouring from her mouth, and then stabilized. Breathing normally, fever broken. The demon expelled not through prayer, not through divine intervention, but through biology weaponized against spiritual infection. When the parents asked how to thank him, he said, "Keep her away from the old well." That's where the demon nested. When our investigators checked the well 3 days later, they found Zamorakian corruption seeping through cracked stone. Minor, but sufficient to allow possession. He diagnosed the environmental cause, treated the symptom, and identified the prevention, all without consulting a single priest or prayer book. The Saradominist Templar stood abruptly. This is heresy. Healing without Saradomin's blessing, banishing demons without holy rites. He's circumventing the natural order. What natural order? Azanadra's voice cut like a blade. The order where mortals grovel before gods for scraps of power. The system where divine permission determines who can heal, who can fight, who can matter. The Majorat leaned forward, ancient eyes burning. I've lived 4,000 years. I've watched civilizations rise and fall. And this Witcher terrifies me more than any elder god, because he represents an idea that could topple everything. You don't need us. The debate that followed would be transcribed, sealed, and locked away, deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. But its core arguments would leak, would spread through adventurer taverns and scholarly circles, would plant seeds of doubt that no prayer could banish. The wise old man posed the central question. Does Geralt serve any god? Saradomin's light, suggested the Templar, grasping. His actions protect the innocent. With no prayer, no devotion, no acknowledgement, Karasi countered. He protects them because he chooses to, not because divinity commands it. Then Zamorak, the druid tried. His power comes from personal strength, from chaos unleashed through will. Zamorak demands worship and sacrifice, Azanadra corrected. The Witcher demands nothing, takes nothing, acknowledges no master. Guthix then, Perfect balance. Neutrality incarnate. Guthix balanced through enforcement, the wise old man said quietly. Through active intervention to maintain equilibrium between factions. Geralt doesn't balance anything. He simply exists, acts according to personal code, refuses to engage with a theological structure at all. The Void Knights exchanged glances. Their order was founded on containing threats to reality itself. Creatures from beyond Gielinor, invasions from other planes. But Geralt wasn't an invasion. He was an immigrant, a refugee, and his very existence posed questions more dangerous than any demon. If power comes from within, who needs the gods? If magic is biology refined through discipline, why worship altars? If a mortal can choose justice without divine command, what makes divinity necessary? This is why he's dangerous, Karasi said finally. Not because he's powerful, we have powerful beings. Not because he's skilled, we have heroes. He's dangerous because his autonomy cannot be corrupted, bargained with, or categorized. He exists outside our system of control, and mortals are noticing. Reports had already surfaced of adventurers attempting to replicate Witcher signs. Mages experimenting with internal magic. Combat trainers studying his defensive techniques that required no shield or armor. The infection was spreading, not of chaos, not of evil, but of dangerous autonomy. The Saradominus Templar made one final attempt at classification. His neutrality must serve some god. Armadil, Siren. There must be divine framework underlying his... There isn't, the wise old man interrupted, and his certainty chilled the room. I've studied his pattern across 73 encounters. He doesn't pray before battle, doesn't thank gods after victory, doesn't invoke blessing or curse. When asked directly by a Saradominist missionary, he said, and I quote, "Your God and I aren't on speaking terms. None of them are." "That's not neutrality," the Templar whispered. "That's apostasy." "Exactly," Azanadra agreed. "And in a world where every major power derives legitimacy from divine authority, apostasy is structural threat. Because if one man can live morally, fight effectively, and exist meaningfully without gods, then what stops everyone else from following?" The council chamber fell into heavy silence. They'd gathered to classify a threat, to understand an anomaly, to restore order. Instead, they'd discovered something far worse, a working alternative to their entire civilization's foundation. Geralt of Rivia wasn't just a powerful outsider. He was proof that Gielinor's theological prison was voluntary, that the bars could be bent, that mortals had more potential than the gods had allowed them to believe. "We need to contain this," Karasi said finally, "before the idea spreads further." "How?" the wise old man asked, genuinely curious. "He's committed no crime, broken no laws, helped more people than most adventurers. What charge do we bring? Unauthorized competence? Unapproved self-sufficiency? We send him against something impossible," the Zamorakian druid suggested, a cruel smile crossing her face. "A threat so overwhelming that even his internal magic fails. Let him die heroically, become a cautionary tale. See what happens when you reject divine protection?" Azanadra nodded slowly. "The Queen Black Dragon. She's been dormant, but we could encourage activity. Lure him with reports of the villagers threatened. He's demonstrated pattern. He responds to civilian danger. We set the trap. He falls into it. Problem solved. And if he wins?" The wise old man's question hung in the air. No one answered, because they'd all seen the footage, read the reports, felt the tremor in reality's foundations. If Geralt killed a dragon that required divine blessing to even approach, if he proved that peak mortality could rival low-tier divinity, the theological framework of Gielinor wouldn't just crack, it would shatter. "We vote," Karasi said grimly. "Send him against the Queen Black Dragon." All in favor. Every hand rose, even the wise old man's, though his was slowest, waited with understanding of what they were truly voting for. Not just a man's death, but the suppression of dangerous truth, the preservation of comfortable lie over uncomfortable freedom. The motion passed unanimously. Outside the sealed archive, Gielinor continued its normal rhythm. Adventurers grinding, merchants trading, gods watching from their distant thrones. But in that hidden chamber beneath Falador, the powers that shaped reality had acknowledged a terrible thing. They were afraid, not of Geralt's swords, or his signs, or his mutations. They were afraid of his example, and fear in the hands of the powerful always demanded sacrifice. The trap was laid with bureaucratic precision. A desperate villager arrived at the Varrock Tavern, where Geralt had taken temporary residence. A young woman named Alara, whose husband and children had supposedly vanished near the Grotworm Lair entrance. She wept convincingly, spoke of strange shadows and dragon roars echoing from deep caverns. She offered everything she had, 17 gold pieces and a family heirloom amulet. The Void Knights had coached her well. Make it personal. Make it about innocent lives. The Witcher responds to civilian danger. Geralt listened without interruption, cat eyes narrowing as he studied her trembling hands, the slight hesitation in her breathing, the too perfect desperation in her voice. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then, "Who sent you?" Alara's mask cracked. Just a flicker, a widening of eyes, a caught breath. But enough. Geralt nodded slowly. "Doesn't matter. If there's really something down there hunting people, it needs killing. If there isn't, I'll know soon enough." He stood, checking his potions, his oils, his blade edges with methodical care. "Keep your gold. If I find your family, I'll bring them back. If I find bones, I'll at least give you certainty." She tried to protest, to maintain the fiction, but he was already moving toward the door. "One thing," he called back. "Tell whoever's watching that I know this is a setup. Tell them I'm going anyway. And tell them that if innocent people are actually in danger because of their political games, I'll come back for them next." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Alara fled to report to her Void Knight handlers, and Geralt set out for the Grotworm Lair with the resigned determination of a man who'd walked into traps before and walked out bloodied, but alive. The caverns beneath the lair spiraled down through geological ages, each layer colder and darker than the last. Geralt navigated by the faint glow of his Witcher senses, the world rendered in thermal signatures and magical residue, allowing him to see what normal eyes missed. He found the grotworms first, massive segmented creatures that should have been immediate threats. Instead, he studied their movement patterns, noted their feeding grounds, and simply walked past them. They sensed something in him, something that read as neither prey nor predator but other, and their primitive instincts chose avoidance over confrontation. Deeper, past the royal chambers where the largest grotworms nested, past the threshold where even experienced adventurers turned back. warned by prayer that something unholy waited ahead. Geralt felt no such warning. His medallion provided different information, vibrating steadily against his chest in the pattern he'd learned to recognize as ancient draconid, significantly powerful, confined space ahead. The Queen Black Dragon's lair was a cathedral of darkness. Dragonkin architecture lined the walls, impossible angles, non-Euclidean geometry that hurt to perceive, magical circuitry that predated human civilization by millennia. The dragon herself lay coiled around a platform suspended over bottomless void, her scales absorbing light, her breath creating the condensation patterns that Geralt recognized immediately. He crouched in the shadows at the entrance, withdrew his journal, and began taking notes with the clinical detachment of a professional monster hunter. Draconid, definitely, but wrong, corrupted. He sketched her head structure, noting the extra horn growths, the crystalline protrusions that suggested magical mutation. Volatile pheromones. Attack pattern likely based on elemental cycling, fire, poison, maybe soul manipulation, given the dragonkin wards. He studied the arena's layout, mapping sight lines and cover points. Confined space. Can't rely on distance. Need close quarters efficiency. From his alchemy pouch, he selected specific oils. Draconic oil for his silver sword, a mixture that would burn through dragon scales like acid through flesh. He prepared potions, black blood in case she tried to drain him, thunderbolt to enhance his already superhuman reflexes, tawny owl to accelerate his sign regeneration. Each preparation was precise, methodical, born from hundreds of dragon contracts across dozens of worlds. The Queen Black Dragon's eyes opened, ancient, malevolent, aware. "Another mortal comes to die," she rumbled, voice shaking the cavern walls. "The gods send their sacrifices regularly now. Tell me, little thing, which divine blessing do you carry? Which prayer will you scream as I consume you?" Geralt stood, rolling his shoulders, settling into the combat stance. No gods, no prayers, just a professional doing a job. The dragon's laugh was sulphurous. "Then you are a fool. Only divine protection has allowed mortals to wound me. Only blessed weapons can pierce my—" She stopped mid-sentence as Geralt drew his silver sword, the blade gleaming with oil that radiated the heat without flame. The scent hit her. Alchemical warfare designed specifically for her species, a concentrated poison that her draconic instincts immediately recognized as lethal. No blessing, no prayer. Just biology, weaponized through study and preparation. "What manner of—" she began. Geralt attacked. The Queen Black Dragon's first breath weapon came with continental force. A gout of flame that should have reduced any mortal to ash, blessed or not. Geralt's left hand snapped up, fingers forming the Quen symbol, and amber energy wrapped around him like a second skin. The dragonfire broke against the shield, diffusing into harmless heat. The magical principle was simple: absolute protection for finite duration, powered not by prayer points or rune consumption, but by Geralt's own life force. His mutated biology converting will into tangible defense. The shield shattered after 3 seconds. Geralt was already moving. He rolled beneath her snapping jaws, came up alongside her foreleg, and struck. 2 quick slashes that carved through obsidian scales and drew black ichor. The draconic oil burned, eating into her flesh with alchemical fury. She roared and twisted, her tail sweeping the platform in a strike that could shatter castle walls. Geralt didn't try to block it. He traced Ard in the air, and the concussive blast altered the tail's trajectory by crucial inches. enough for him to duck underneath and counterstrike at the exposed underside. Impossible! The dragon's confusion was palpable. Your movements. No human moves like that. You're enhanced. Mutations, Geralt confirmed between strikes. Trials of the grasses. Amplified reflexes. Enhanced strength. Altered metabolism. He dodged another flame burst, this time without bothering with Quen, simply reading her breath weapons wind up and positioning himself at the thermal blind spot. Your kind isn't unique. I've killed draconids on 6 worlds. You're bigger, but the principles are the same. She switched tactics, breathing poison clouds that would have melted an adventurer's lungs, even through protection prayers. Geralt pulled a fabric across his face, just mundane cloth soaked in specific herbs, and kept fighting. The poison was magical in origin, but it still operated on chemical principles. Block the inhalation vector, neutralize the contact burn with counteragents, survive the exposure duration. The Queen Black Dragon began to panic. Every tool in her arsenal, flame, poison, physical power, even her attempts at fear-inducing roars, met practical counters. No prayers negated, no blessings invoked. Just a man who'd studied, prepared, and adapted to draconid combat through brutal repetition. She was ancient, powerful, nearly divine in her accumulated might. He was mortal, scarred, exhausted. But she was also predictable, and he'd killed predictable monsters for decades. "Who are you?" she demanded, genuine fear creeping into her voice. "Geralt of Rivia, Witcher, and you're just another contract." He struck the final blow with Igni. The fire sign manifested differently than any pyromancy Gielinor had seen. No runes consumed, no magical formula spoken. Geralt's hand thrust forward, fingers splayed, and pure thermal force erupted from his palm. Heat generated through metabolic conversion, focused through neurological pathways rewired by mutations. The flame was white-hot, concentrated, sustained beyond any natural duration. It punched through the dragon's already weakened scales, found the vulnerable flesh beneath, and burned. The Queen Black Dragon shrieked. Her soul began to unravel, not banished by prayer, not purified by blessing, but simply destroyed by force that operated on principles her magical defenses couldn't categorize. The Dragonkin wards tried to compensate, to reinforce her essence, but Geralt's magic was writing new rules temporarily. For 3 eternal seconds, the cavern existed in a state where Gielinoran magical law and Witcher biological alchemy overlapped, and the overlap was violent. Reality protested. The rune essence in the walls flared amber, the same color as Geralt's Quen shield, the same hue as his signs. Adventurers across Gielinor felt their prayer points drain spontaneously, their spell accuracy drop, as if something had momentarily rewritten the fundamental constants of magic. At the wizard's tower, alarm crystals screamed. In the Zeroshan stronghold, Azanadra clutched his head, feeling the metaphysical framework of reality buckle and strain under impossible contradiction. The Queen Black Dragon's corpse dissolved into ash and dragonfire, her soul unable to maintain cohesion under the dual assault of lethal injury and ontological impossibility. The Dragonkin platform beneath Geralt's feet cracked, ancient magic circuits overloading as they tried to process power that drew from no god, no altar, no approved source. Geralt stood in the center of the destruction, breathing heavily, silver sword still smoking with residual Igni heat. His medallion had stopped vibrating. The threat was eliminated. Around him, the cavern's enchantments destabilized, wards failing, containment circles breaking, magical locks opening because the fundamental assumption underlying them, that all power came from divine or elder sources, had been momentarily proven false. He cleaned his blade methodically, reapplied oil to preserve the silver, and checked his remaining potions. 2 swallows left, 1 thunderbolt. The black blood unused. She'd relied on breath weapons rather than blood draining, a tactical choice that had cost her. He made mental notes for future dragon contracts, assuming he survived this world long enough to need them. The ascent back through the grotworm tunnels was quiet. The creatures sensed death on him now, fresh and absolute, and gave him even wider berth. When he emerged into daylight, he found a Void Knight observation post waiting. 3 knights in full armor, hands on hilts, expressions unreadable behind visors. "You killed her," one said flatly. Statement, not question. "Contracts fulfilled," Geralt replied, "though I'm guessing there was no real family in danger." Silence. Then, "How?" "Preparation. Study. Experience killing things bigger and meaner than me." He met their visors with a cat-yellow gaze. "Your turn to answer. Was this supposed to kill me or just test me?" More silence. Finally, grudgingly, "Both. The council wanted you removed. Quietly. With plausible deniability. Then tell your council they failed. And tell them something else." Geralt's voice dropped to a tone the knights would remember in nightmares. "I've dealt with kings and sorceresses and gods who thought they could manipulate me for political games. They learned that witchers don't have loyalty to crowns or causes. We have professional ethics. You put innocent people in danger to test me. I let it go once. I find out you've done it again. And your council will find out what happens when you make an enemy of someone who kills monsters for a living." He walked past them, heading toward Mauritania's distant fog, leaving the knights standing in stunned silence. Behind him, in the depths of the grotworm lair, reality slowly knitted itself back together. But the scar remained, a place where, for just a moment, the rules had been different, where power without divinity had proven stronger than divine blessing. The Void Knights would report this. The council would convene again. The terror would spread further, because the Queen Black Dragon, a creature that required divine intervention to even approach, had fallen to a mortal who brought nothing but skill, preparation, and refusal to acknowledge cosmic hierarchy. If peak mortality could kill a near god, then what separated the divine from the dedicated? The question would haunt Gielinor's power structures for generations. But Geralt didn't care about their theological crisis. He had more monsters to hunt, and something in Mauritania was making his medallion hum with warning. The contamination, the dangerous idea that mortals didn't need permission to be powerful, had spread too far to contain. And the Witcher, unbothered by their fear, simply moved on to the next contract. Geralt didn't celebrate the kill. While the Void Knights scrambled to report the impossible back to their superiors, while scholars across Gielinor recorded seismic readings of the metaphysical rupture, while the council reconvened an emergency session, Geralt simply walked. He'd collected no trophy from the dragon's corpse, claimed no treasure from her hoard, accepted no accolades or titles. The job was done. The threat was eliminated. That was enough. He reached Mauritania as dusk settled, crossing the Salve River with barely a glance at the temple guardian who tried to warn him about the undead-infested swamp beyond. The medallion was humming again, not the sharp warning of immediate danger, but the constant low vibration that indicated ambient wrongness. Mauritania was saturated with it. Vampires ruling the mortal cattle, werewolves hunting in organized packs, ghasts rising from poisoned bogs. An entire region twisted by Zamorak's influence and Lord Draken's tyranny. To Geralt, it was just another Tuesday, another gothic nightmare he'd walked into, would walk through, and would eventually leave behind once the contracts were done. But behind him, in the civilized kingdoms of Gielinor, the damage had already metastasized beyond repair. The wise old man sat alone in his Draenor study, surrounded by scrolls and reports and scrying crystals that showed the spreading chaos. His hands, ancient hands that had cast spells older than most kingdoms, trembled as he wrote his final assessment of the Geralt phenomenon. Today marks the 3rd week since the Witcher's arrival, and the 7th day since the Queen Black Dragon's elimination. I must document what I dare not speak aloud in council. I am afraid, not of the man himself, but of what he represents. In my 400 years, I have witnessed God's walk among mortals. I have seen elder artifacts reshape continents. I have watched empires rise on divine favor and collapse when that favor withdrew. But I have never seen anything that frightened me as much as Geralt of Rivia's casual competence. He hunts monsters by choice, not divine command. He wields power that answers to no altar, no prayer, no cosmic authority. And most terrifying of all, he refuses to judge between our gods, treating Saradomin and Zamorak with equal indifference, as if their eternal wars merely background noise to his actual work. A man who hunts monsters by choice, who possesses power without permission, who cannot be bargained with or corrupted. Such a being cannot exist within Guthix's balance. Yet he does, and that impossibility is more destabilizing than any demon invasion. Because if he can exist outside the system, if he can operate effectively without divine sanction, then what stops every mortal from attempting the same? What prevents the masses from realizing that the gods are not sources of power, merely gatekeepers to power that might exist elsewhere, might be developed internally, might have been available all along? The theological foundation of our world cracks with every report of his actions. And I fear that when it finally shatters, we will discover that we were prisoners who mistook our chains for architecture. The wise old man sealed the document with warding magic so complete that only his death would break it. Some truths were too dangerous for contemporaries. Let future generations judge whether he'd been paranoid or prescient. Within a month of the dragon's death, reports began flooding in from across Gielinor. Priests at Saradomin's encampment documented spontaneous prayer point drain. Adventurers kneeling at altars, finding their connection. Flickering, not severed, but momentarily uncertain, as if the divine bandwidth had been interrupted by something broadcasting on the same frequency. At the wizard's tower, elemental runes began destabilizing. Fire runes would occasionally burn cold. Water runes produced steam without liquid. The fundamental constants of runecrafting, locked in place since the First Age, were experiencing microscopic variances. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to prove they weren't actually constant, that they could be altered. The most disturbing reports came from the Void Knights' outposts. Combat mages practicing their spell rotations would occasionally feel their magic shift. For just a moment, they'd cast Ice Barrage without consuming runes, the spell manifesting through will alone before snapping back to normal mechanics. It felt, they reported, like touching something forbidden, something that had always been possible, but deliberately hidden. Veteran adventurers began experimenting. If the Witcher could generate shields through gesture alone, could they? Small groups gathered in private, attempting to replicate his signs, his techniques, his apparent ability to generate power internally. Most failed. A few reported momentary success, a flicker of force, a spark of flame. Nothing sustained, but enough to prove it wasn't impossible, just unprecedented. The gods themselves remained silent on the matter. Perhaps they hadn't noticed. Perhaps they had and were deliberating responses. Or perhaps, most terrifying, they'd always known this potential existed in mortals and had spent millennia ensuring nobody discovered it. The War Council met one final time to issue their official determination. The chamber felt heavier now, laden with decisions they couldn't take back and consequences they couldn't contain. As Anadra spoke for the assembled powers, we classify the arrival and subsequent activities of the entity known as Geralt of Rivia as the Geralt phenomenon, an ontological contamination, a living paradox that exists between mortality, autonomy, and chaos. His continued presence threatens the structural stability of Gielinor's theological framework. Commander Karasi added the military assessment. All attempts at elimination have failed. All attempts at classification have failed. All attempts at recruitment or bargaining have been refused. He represents an uncontrolled variable that our systems cannot process. The wise old man concluded with grim finality. We recommend immediate information quarantine. All reports of his activities are to be classified and sealed. Any adventurers claiming to have witnessed his techniques are to be discredited. The idea that power can exist without divine permission must not spread further. The vote was unanimous. The Geralt phenomenon would be officially denied, suppressed, and eventually forgotten. Or so they hoped. But across Gielinor, in taverns and training grounds and adventurer guild halls, the stories were already spreading. The Witcher who killed a dragon with nothing but preparation. The wanderer who needed no god. The monster slayer whose medallion hummed at corruption. Whose yellow eyes saw through political games. Whose blades asked no permission before delivering justice. Beyond the Salve River, Geralt's trail simply ended. Search parties sent into Mauritania found nothing. No tracks, no campsites, no witnesses beyond scattered reports of a white-haired stranger who'd killed a particularly vicious werewolf pack, or cured a village of vampire thralls using alchemical blood purification, or negotiated a temporary truce between humans and non-hostile ghasts through sheer force of pragmatic neutrality. The Firewatch reported him to Lord Drakon. The vampire lord personally investigated, intrigued by tales of a mortal who might pose interesting challenge. But by the time Drakon mobilized his forces, Geralt had already moved deeper into the swamp, perhaps toward the haunted woods, perhaps toward Burg de Rot, perhaps vanished entirely. Some claimed he'd found a way home, back to his own world. Others insisted he'd been killed by Mauritania's horrors, and his body lost in the bogs. The most disturbing theory suggested he'd simply integrated into the region's ecosystem, another apex predator, hunting in territory that conventional wisdom deemed uninhabitable. The truth, as always, was simpler and more mundane. Geralt had found a cottage on the edge of the Mortmire swamp. Abandoned, warded with broken magic, haunted by minor spirits that his presence naturally suppressed. He'd repaired what could be repaired, established basic alchemy equipment, and settled in to do what witchers did, wait for contracts to find him. The monsters of Mauritania were numerous, varied, and underserved by conventional adventurers. Good hunting ground, better yet, far enough from civilization that theological politics couldn't reach him. He'd walked away from kingdoms before. He'd do it again. But something had changed in Gielinor. Something subtle and irreversible. Every monster slayer across the realm, from fledgling adventurers in Lumbridge to legendary warriors in the wilderness, began to feel it. A tremor in their medallions, assuming they wore them. A hum in their combat instincts. An awareness that violence could be more than divine blessing or magical formula. That it could be craft refined to art, art elevated to principle. Slayer masters reported apprentices asking strange questions. Can we learn to fight without prayers? If magic comes from runes, where do runes come from? What if there are other ways? The questions couldn't be suppressed. The idea had taken root. Somewhere in the Mortmire swamp, in a cottage that didn't exist on any map, Geralt sat by a dying fire and maintained his equipment. Silver sword sharpened, potions restocked, bestiary updated with Gielinor's unique monsters. His medallion hung quiet around his neck. The constant hum of Mauritania's wrongness, now just ambient noise. He'd survived worse worlds, met stranger gods, fought deadlier monsters. This place was just another stop on an involuntary journey through realities that kept shattering and reforming around him. Eventually, another portal would open. Another crisis would pull him elsewhere. Until then, there were contracts to fulfill and creatures to slay. Outside, in the poison swamp, something howled. Not quite werewolf, not quite ghost, something in between. Geralt's eyes opened, cat pupil slits narrowing in the darkness. His hand found his silver blade automatically. Leshen derivative, maybe, he muttered, standing, or local nature spirit corrupted. Either way. The medallion hummed its warning. The door opened. The Witcher walked into Mauritania's night with the casual confidence of a man who'd made a career of walking into darkness and dragging monsters out into the light. Behind him, across Gielinor, in council chambers and prayer halls and wizard towers, the powerful continued their desperate attempts to contain what could not be contained. The idea that mortals might be more than they'd been told. That power might exist beyond permission. That autonomy was not heresy but birthright. The Geralt phenomenon had been classified, sealed, and officially denied. But every monster slayer in Gielinor felt the tremor in their soul, a faint hum, barely perceptible, like a medallion warning of danger nearby. And they knew, with the certainty of instinct honed through countless battles, that somewhere in the darkness, the Witcher still hunted, still refused, still proved, with every professional kill, that the system was negotiable. The theological order of Gielinor had survived elder god wars and divine betrayals. But it might not survive the simple, devastating question that Geralt's existence posed to every mortal who witnessed his trail. If he doesn't need the gods, do we? The answer, whatever it might be, would reshape the world. But that was a problem for prophets and politicians. Geralt had more immediate concerns. There were monsters in the swamp. And monsters, whatever their nature, whatever their origin, whatever divine protection they claimed, monsters could always be killed. He just needed the right preparation, the right tools, and the professional detachment to do the job without getting emotionally invested in the metaphysical implications. After all, he was just a witcher, and witchers killed monsters. That's all he'd ever been, all he'd ever needed to be. The rest was just noise,